Hi everyone. I wanted to share with you a short idea, actually on last week's Torah portion, Tisa. And the reason I'm sharing it with you now, not just because I haven't yet prepared a Dvar Torah for this coming week, Vayakel Pikude, but really because the theme of the talk last week had to do with the Mishkan, which of course is a major theme in this week's Torah portion as well. And secondly, because I included an insight into the Passover Haggadah, and I think it may be something that would help people as they begin to make their Passover preparations as well. So I began in Parshat Ki Tisa by sharing the Midrash. It's a Midrash that many of us are familiar with that points out that there's no chronological order necessarily in the Torah, that things may appear in one place, but they may have actually taken place chronologically after some event that appears after. We know this specifically with regards to the Mishkan, with regards to the tabernacle. Even though the Mishkan is described earlier in the Torah before the sin of the Chet HaEgel, the sin of the golden calf, most commentaries point out that because there is no necessarily set order, it's very possible that the sin of the golden calf actually chronologically took place first, and then as a tikkun, as a repair, as a healing for that sin, we were given the mitzvah of building the Mishkan. The reason why I mentioned that midrash is because the midrash actually focuses in its statement about ein mukdam v'muchar b'Torah, that there is no chronological order necessarily, on the Parsha of Ki Tisa of the mitzvah of Machatzit HaShekel, that everyone is to bring, everyone 20 and up, is to bring a half shekel for their counting. That this statement, this mitzvah, which also precedes the sin of the golden calf, actually, in the understanding of the Midrash, took place after the sin of the golden calf, also as a form of repair, a form of tikkun, as part of the entire tikkun that the Mishkan represents. And it focuses specifically on the Machatzit HaShekel as the beginning of this process of repair. And it makes sense to make this point. If you look at the very beginning of the Parsha in Ki Tisa, it talks about how this Machatzit HaShekel, giving a half a shekel, everyone would bring forth and give it for the purposes of the Beit HaMikdash, the Mishkan first, and then ultimately the Beit HaMikdash. It's called a kofir, something that will provide atonement for kapara nafshotechem, for your souls. And so we need atonement after the sin of the golden calf, so it makes sense that it actually came afterwards. What do we learn to learn from this? What are the deeper lessons? I'd like to suggest two. One, the Midrash itself provides. It says that very often you see failure, you see bad things, and you get stuck on it. And it's important not to get stuck, but to realize that very often this is the beginning of something even more powerful and even more important. And very often quite good. The Mishkan, of course, the tabernacle, and what ultimately the Beit HaMikdash comes to represent, the temple, came about only because of the sin of the Chet HaEgel. And so therefore, while we should not celebrate our sins, we should also not let the opportunity go by and not learn from them. That embedded in the fabric of Torah is the recovering from sin and building something even more special than existed before. I'm reminded of the famous story told about Thomas Watson, who was the CEO of IBM, and he called someone to his office who had made a number of mistakes and cost millions of dollars for the company. And of course, the person who was called into the office assumed that he was going to be fired. And he walked in and says, I suppose you want me to hand in my resignation because of all the losses that I've cost the company. To which Thomas Watson responded to him and said, no, we've now just spent millions of dollars in your education. We want to get that education back out from you. That the mistakes should never be thrown away. Mistakes should be saved and almost savored and learned from it, of course, and then create something much more positive on the other end. And the Midrash references this idea by referring us to the sin of the brothers, of Yosef's brothers. When they all sat down and got ready to sell the brother into slavery, this, of course, was a great sin. But what came from that is that Yosef was sold into slavery, eventually becomes very important in Egypt, eventually becomes the source of salvation by organizing the Egyptian economy during the famine. And not just the salvation for the brothers, saving their lives from famine and starvation, but for millions upon millions of people. Yosef saved so many lives, and it was, oddly enough, only because of the failure of the brothers in selling them into slavery in the first place. And so we have to always keep that in mind, that that's in the fabric of Torah, not to let a mistake go by without seeing it as an opportunity to learn and become better. The second message I think that we learn from this midrash about the idea that our the Machatzit HaShekel is preceded the sin, is the Machatzit HaShekel itself. To look at that, why this mitzvah, why this half shekel, what's significant about it? So to do that, I think we should turn to the Gemara in Bava Batra, because there's a statement there when it says Ki Tisa, raising up the Rosh B'nai Yisrael. This is a way of bringing the half shekels to count the B'nai Yisrael. It's understood in the Gemara of not just counting, but raising the heads. How do you elevate the individual people of B'nai Yisrael? And the way the Gemara understands this mitzvah, Machatzit HaShekel, it asks the question, B'ma tarum keren Yisrael, how will we know what is the pride of Israel? What brings about the pride of the Jewish people? And then the Gemara goes on and talks primarily about the mitzvah of tzedakah, of charity. And so one would think that that's what's really so special and beautiful about the Machatzit HaShekel, that it has to do with charity. And it is giving over money. And so we can understand why it's related in that way. I mean, the sin of the golden calf was using money for bad, so now we're using money for good. So that might be one understanding of why specifically the Machatzit HaShekel is part of the process of repair. But I think we can go something even a little bit further, because in truth, giving to the half shekel is not really tzedakah, because you're giving it to the needs of the tabernacle. You're not giving it to poor people. So it's not really tzedakah. It's giving it to the community. So what I'd like to suggest is it's not giving of tzedakah per se, but the motivation behind the half a shekel and the motivation behind charity, that's what's really important. And what's the motivation? What is the motivation of giving the half a shekel? And here, I think the answer has to do with a concern of involving every single person in a mitzvah. The half shekel, of course, after all, was that everyone gave, right? Everyone's incomplete. Everyone gives only half, but everyone had to participate. And therefore, we learned the lesson that everyone is valued, everyone should be included, and everyone is needed. You see this in the building of the Mishkan itself, right? We're told that Bezalel and Eliav are chosen and selected to be sort of the leaders of building the tabernacle. Bezalel comes from the tribe of Yehuda, which is the largest, most prestigious tribe. It's the royal tribe. And Eliav comes from Dan, which is the smallest tribe, it's the least significant. Rabbi Dov Weinberger points out the Mishkan, the building of the Mishkan, with these two ends of the spectrum of Yehuda and Dan, shows that everyone has to be involved in the process. That when every one of Bnei Yisrael is participating in something, we accomplish great things, such as the Mishkan. That's what the message of the Machatzit HaShekel, that's the motivation of giving. And we see that with tzedakah as well, right? When everyone feels a responsibility for the needs of other people, less fortunate, that's when we do something and accomplish something of greatness. And when we don't, right, when we don't all do things together, and that's when we begin to fail. I'll give you an example, and I think this is a beautiful teaching of the Ben Ish Chai with regards to your Passover, with regards to Pesach, and hopefully something you can use in the Passover Seder. He asked the question, why do we, at the very beginning of the Seder, right after Kadesh, right? Why do we then dip, some green item, the karpas, into salt water? So what's the significance of that? Not just the significance, right? There are a lot of different explanations of why we do. Karpas, some say, is a Greek word having to do with spring, so it's like to be cognizant of the time periods in which we're experiencing Passover, the spring. Some say that it has to do with, like, this is part of royalty, that we're dipping, right? Usually slaves don't get a chance to dip their food. We get to dip our food. The Gemara says the real explanation is that it's just doing something odd. So children will ask, why is this night different? What are you doing? These are all possible explanations, but none of them really explain why it's so important that it has to be at the very beginning of the Seder, before we make the blessing over the matzah, before we eat. This is the very first thing. Why does this have to be so early on? So the Ben Ish Chai references Rashi. Rashi points out that karpas is also a word that's used when the Torah describes, if we go back to the story of the brothers selling Yosef into slavery, when they try to fool their father and say that he's been killed and torn apart by wild beasts, and it says that they dip his ketone pasim, his coat of many colors, into blood, right, to try to fool their father Jacob. So when it speaks about the ketone pasim that Yaakov gives to his son Yosef the first time, Rashi uses the word karpas as a sort of a silk to describe the material that garment was made out of. And so therefore, when we are dipping the karpas, Rashi would probably suggest that what we're really dipping, this is also based on the Yerushalmi, what we're really dipping or symbolically dipping is the coat of Yosef into blood. Perhaps that's why the Rambam says you don't dip your karpas into salt water, you dip it into charoset. Charoset, which is often made out of wine, perhaps a little bit more symbolic of blood. It makes sense in that regard that that's the dipping that's taking place. So based upon this teaching, the Ben Ish Chai then answers our question. Why does this have to come at the very beginning of the Seder? Because you have to understand how we got into the situation of being slaves in the first place. We got into the situation of being slaves in the first place because we abandoned one of our brothers. We threw one of our brothers away. We discarded him. We tried to fool our father, fool our Avinu Shabbat and not care for him after all. That's how we begin our Seder. To realize that what gets us into trouble is when we abandon one another, and of course when we want to accomplish something great, like building of a tabernacle, the Machatzit HaShekel is the first step in that process. The idea that everyone has to give, everyone has to be involved, everyone has to feel a sense of communal responsibility. I just want to end this idea with a story about basketball. Tisa marked the Shloshim, the passing of my brother, Jonathan Per, Yehuda, Aaron Ben Moshe Babatya. My brother went to the University of Florida, and he was a basketball fan of their basketball team. And so I thought I'd share insight based upon their basketball team. The University of Florida, for many, many years, was not such a good basketball team. In the 70s, 80s, 90s, they had 1 year, I think, that they were pretty good. They maybe went to the finals in the 90s, or 87 perhaps even. I don't recall exactly. But they weren't a top 5 team, top 10 team for the vast majority of their history. And the same thing took place in 2000, 2001, 2002. Anyway, something changed in 2004. According to the authors of the book Click, they argue that it was a fluke, a random, not necessarily mistake, but random occurrence of the housing department at the University of Florida, that they put together 4 members of the basketball team, 4 freshmen who were just drafted. Corey Brewer, Tareen Green, Yachnim Noah, and Al Harford. And they put all 4 of them together in the same apartment. And this usually doesn't happen, but they were all in the same apartment, and they did everything together, right? They immediately clicked. And so therefore they spent all their time together. They went out socially together. They played basketball together. Even when they weren't in practice, they would take on other people in pickup games. The only requirement is that the 4 of them play together. Now, as freshmen, they didn't really play the first year that they were drafted. But the second year, all the seniors left, so they were put in position to play. No one really expected too much of them, but all of a sudden they started winning game after game after game, and they win the SEC Finals, Championship, then they win the NCAA Championship through March Madness, beating UCLA. And everyone is shocked. These group of sophomores, wow, they just won the entire championship. They all, of course, could have gone to the NBA, got drafted. They were all superstars by this point in time. But they all, as they were wont to do, sat down together and they decided, no, we're going to go another year together. And the same thing happened. This time, though, they were favorites. They went through the entire year. They beat Ohio State in the finals. After that, after winning 2 back-to-back championships, never done before by Florida, very rarely done by anyone, they were all superstars. They were all drafted. And this is where I think the story really packs its biggest punch. They all were drafted high in the NBA. And they all went to different teams. And none of them, though, really were as successful as they were, even though they had great expectations winning back-to-back of being superstars. Right? Al Horford did pretty well in Atlanta and then eventually goes on to the Celtics, and he has had a pretty good career. Joachim Noah, however, came out, people expecting him to be a superstar for the Chicago Bulls, and then he went to the Knicks, had disciplinary problems wherever he went and never really succeeded. Corey Brewer wasn't that great in Minnesota. Toreen Green was then eventually shipped off to play in Greece. And so you had these very high expectations, but when they went separate ways, they weren't as successful. When they played together, they were incredibly successful. And I think that's part of the lesson. Right? Part of the lesson is that 1 + 1 can add up to 3. You can accomplish much more. Than the sum of the parts is greater than the individual parts. That's the lesson of Machatzit HaShekel. That's the lesson of the Jewish people. When we all work together, we can accomplish great things. But if we leave even just one person out, we actually never can come close to fulfilling our ultimate potential. Shabbat Shalom.